When people think about medieval warfare, they usually imagine battlefields full of swords. But a real medieval sword was never just a piece of steel. It was the cost of iron, charcoal, skilled labor, transport, and constant upkeep. And for most people in medieval Europe, even one decent blade could represent weeks or months of income. Once you look beyond the weapon itself, the picture gets even bigger. Armor, horses, wages, food, and taxes turned war into a massive economic burden. So the real question is not only how much a medieval sword cost. The bigger question is what that price tells us about who could afford to fight, how armies were equipped, and why the economics of war mattered just as much as the fighting itself. Number 1. The coin. To understand what a medieval sword really cost, start with the money, not the weapon. In medieval England, a pound meant 20 shillings, or 240 pence. But most ordinary people felt prices in pennies. Around 1300, a laborer is often estimated at roughly 2 pence a day. That means 6 pence was about 3 days of work, 1 shilling was about 6 days, and 10 shillings was about 60. Even that needs care, because medieval wages varied by place, by season, and by whether food or lodging were included in the deal. Still, as a working benchmark, it lets you see scale. And scale is the whole issue here. When people ask whether a sword was cheap or expensive, the real question is not just the number written in an account. The real question is how many workdays a household could turn into metal after food, rent, fuel, clothes, animals, seed, and dues had already been paid. That is why medieval prices can look strangely small to a modern viewer while feeling very heavy in their original world. And before we even get to the blade, one more thing matters. There was no single medieval market. The prices that survive come from different centuries, different regions, and different kinds of records. So what we are really tracing is a range, not one clean, universal price tag. Number 2, the range. And once you look at that range, the first surprise is how wide it really is. In one medieval Welsh legal valuation, a plain sword is worth 12 pence, while a sword with gold or silver on the hilt is worth 24 pence. In the same scale, a spear is 4 pence and a battle axe is 2. A compiled English price list from the 1340s even includes a cheap peasant sword at 6 pence. Then the inventory evidence adds more texture. Rural English household records value swords anywhere from 12 pence up to 10 shillings, with most below 40 pence. In 15th century Canterbury, one sword is listed at 2 shillings 8 pence, while a broken sword appears at just 6 pence. These numbers are not all coming from the same kind of source. Some are legal values, some are household appraisals, some are damaged goods. And that is exactly why the spread is so wide. Put those prices against a 2 pence daily wage, and the picture gets a lot clearer. A 12 pence sword is about 6 days of labor. A 2 shillings 8 pence sword is 16 days. 40 pence is 20 days, and 10 shillings is 60 days, all before food and rent. So the honest answer is not that a medieval sword always cost a year's wages, and it is also not that it was pocket change. It could be a used sidearm, a plain fighting sword, a better quality blade, or a decorated status object, and the price moved with that reality.
Number 3, the real price.
That spread makes sense once you stop thinking of a sword as just an iron bar with an edge. Medieval soldiers were usually expected to bring their own gear, and much of that gear was locally made, reused, repaired, or handed down. Iron was difficult to extract and shape, so even plain weapons carried real craft cost. And the blade was only part of the object. A usable sword also needed fittings, a grip, a scabbard, and a belt. The decorative side could change the bill fast. The Welsh valuation already shows that visible ornament on the hilt can double the listed value, from 12 pence to 24. English records show the same basic logic in daily life. Scabbards were worn on the belt as part of dress, which meant they were not just storage, they were display. One 1418 record lists a sheath, a basilard, and a silver-adorned belt together at 13 shillings 4 pence. So when people imagine the price of a sword, they often imagine just the blade. But medieval buyers were often paying for a whole visible package. And there was clearly a working market for that package. In 1403, a Winchester furbisher, basically an armorer and weapons specialist, had stock that included 41 swords, 5 basilards, and 3 lance heads. That tells you swords were not mythical objects that existed only in noble halls. They were commercial goods. They were just commercial goods with very uneven quality, condition, and status value. Number 4, the spear. Now the hidden economics of war starts to come into focus, because a sword had prestige, but a spear had the math on its side. In the Welsh legal scale, a plain sword is 12 pence, and a spear is 4. In other words, one plain sword sits in the same value space as 3 spears before you even start talking about decoration. And once you add companion gear, the gap keeps growing. In one rural English record, a sword and shield together are appraised at around 3 shillings. More broadly, medieval military obligation was tied to status and means. Laws expected men to appear with equipment appropriate to their wealth, not with the same kit as the mounted elite. In large expeditions, infantry were more numerous than cavalry, but also less well equipped, and much of their gear was local, practical, and reused. That is why the classic image of the Middle Ages as endless rows of glittering swords can miss the real structure of medieval armies. Swords mattered, no question, but armies expanded fastest through weapons that were cheaper, simpler, and easier to replace. A spear did not need to win a prestige contest. It only needed to be affordable, usable, and available in numbers. And once you look at war through the ledger instead of through romance, that is exactly why simpler weapons carried so much of the real burden. Number 5, the payroll. Once you scale from one fighter to a campaign, the price of the weapon stops being the main number, and wages take over. English armies in the 100 Years' War were built mainly around men-at-arms and archers. Men-at-arms were typically paid 12 pence a day, archers 6 pence, and by the early 15th century, the usual English ratio had shifted to roughly 1 man-at-arms for every 3 archers. That ratio is not just a military detail. It is a budget statement. A captain was not buying one sword once and moving on. He was funding bodies in the field every single day. 30 days of pay for 1 man-at-arms comes to 30 shillings, already above the value of many swords recorded in household inventories. And if you turn the wage rates into even a modest field force, the scale becomes obvious very quickly. A company of 100 men-at-arms and 300 archers, using those standard rates, costs 250 shillings a day, or £12 10 shillings, before you add food, transport, horses, baggage, repairs, or replacements. Stretch that to a month, and you are at £375 in pay alone.
That is the point where the sword stops being the center of the story.
A sword could be expensive to a peasant household, but to a war leader, the deeper problem was sustaining payroll, not just purchasing steel.
Number 6. Horses and armor. And then the really serious money shows up. The sword is the part people notice, but mounted warfare is what really opens the bill. Under Edward I, mounted troops usually made up less than 10% of the fighting men in the army, yet they were the best equipped and most expensive soldiers in it. A Cambridge study on medieval France makes the same point from another angle. Custom and law expected cavalry to arrive with a good horse, good armor, and proper weapons. The horse alone could dwarf sword prices. In 1307, the mean price of 19 destriers bought by the English king from Italian merchants was £26. One was valued at £80, and another destrier bought in 1315 cost £75. Those are top-end war horses, not ordinary mounts. But that is exactly the point. Elite warfare lived in a different financial universe. At the rough 2-pence wage benchmark, that 26-pound horse equals 3,120 days of labor. Armor lived in the same world. Household records include a hauberk at 13 shillings 4 pence and a breastplate at 20 shillings, while one compiled 14th century example puts a knight's total armor at 16 pounds 6 shillings 8 pence, or 1,960 days at the same wage benchmark. So when people say a sword was expensive, that can be true. But in elite warfare, the sword was often not the most expensive thing a fighter owned. Sometimes it was not even close. Number 7. The running bill. Even that still is not the full cost, because military gear kept eating money after the day it was bought. Horses had to be fed whether there was a battle or not. One compiled 13th century example records the cost of keeping an earl's warhorse for 82 summer days at 36 shillings 9.5 pence. That is already more than many sword values in ordinary household records. Missile weapons show the same pattern. A Canterbury inventory prices one bow with 12 arrows at 2 shillings 6 pence, almost the same as a sword in the same list at 2 shillings 8 pence. And another English record is even more revealing. A bow is valued at 8 pence, but a sheaf of arrows at 18 pence. In that case, the expendable part costs more than twice the launcher. So the ongoing expense was not always the bow itself. It was feeding the weapon with ammunition, over and over again. That matters, because it changes how we think about so-called cheap warfare. A spear, a bow, or a modest sidearm might be affordable in isolation. The bill became heavy when weapons had to be maintained, arrows replaced, horses fed, and men kept in service day after day. The cheaper side of war was cheaper, mainly because it scaled better, not because it was free. Number 8. Status and scale. That leaves the sword in a strange but important position. It was absolutely a working weapon, but it was also a public sign of martial standing. It marked who could fight in a certain way, who wanted to look the part, and who could afford more than the bare minimum. At the same time, modern fantasy has badly flattened the picture. Cambridge's recent work on the civilian sword argues that it is wrong to imagine everyone in the high and late Middle Ages routinely walking around with swords. And it stresses that ownership, carrying, and actual use were not the same thing. The records back that up. Swords appear outside royal treasuries and knightly ceremony, in rural household lists, in small-town inventories, and even in the stock of working armorers, so they were not confined to the very top of society. But they were never the whole story of war. The deeper economics sat underneath them, the way military obligation matched social rank, the way infantry outnumbered cavalry.
the way wages accumulated faster than single purchases, and the way horses and armor could consume sums that made sword prices look almost modest by comparison. The gap between owning one sword and equipping whole formations around swords was enormous.